Shut down in Washington and not much is getting done, but it's been a huge week in outer space. A NASA spacecraft has just flown by the most distant object ever visited. It's called Ultima Thule, and it's in the Kuiper Belt, beyond the orbit of Neptune, 4 billion miles from the sun. Also this week, China just landed a lunar rover on the far side of the moon. That is a first. To learn more about both missions, I spoke earlier with the manager of the Planetarium and Science programs at the Hudson River Museum in Yonkers, New York, Marc Taylor. So, Marc, the New Horizons flyby of Ultima Thule, it's certainly impressive, the furthest thing we've ever visited and being that far outside the solar system. What are we hoping to learn from it?
Well, one thing to remember is that it's not outside the solar system. It is ever been able to observe something close up in the solar system. So even though it's beyond Pluto, it's still in a part of space called the Kuiper Belt. And the nice thing about the things in the Kuiper Belt is that they have been isolated away from the sun ever since the solar system formed, we think. So when we're looking at objects out there, we're looking at, as they say, very primitive objects, things which haven't changed very much in billions of years. So as I tell the kids in the planetarium, it's almost like having a conversation with your great 2 billion times removed grandmother.
So what is the Kuiper Belt anyway? The Kuiper Belt for dummies, if you will, for this answer. And also, will there be any practical application of what we learn out there for life on Earth here, or will it just be a window into the history of our planet and the entire solar system?
Okay, well, the second thing first, a lot of times people do ask, what's the practical use of all this? And it is important that we, find out what's going on out there, that keeps people interested, it makes life worth living, and so forth. But there's another reason, which is that there are objects like this closer to the Earth. And they are interesting to us, or relevant to us, for two reasons. One is that they occasionally hit the Earth or come close to the Earth. The more we understand about how they're constructed, the more we understand about how we might be able to deflect one or push it away. It's not going to work like Bruce Willis drilling a hole with a bomb and blowing it up. That's not going to work. But there are some other things that might work. But we have to understand what they're like structurally before we can do those. So the more we know about that, the better.
So, and I've heard that Ultima Thule has a unique structure to it that you want to get into. I'm curious about that. And also, I've read a lot of talk about craters or an apparent lack of craters on Ultima Thule.
Yes. Well, in terms of structure, I have this neat little model here. So these actually represent the two pieces of Ultima Thule. And they're calling one Ultima and one Thule, but those are just nicknames for now. One of them is about 9 miles wide, the other one's about 15, and we think that they started out maybe hundreds of millions of years ago as separate objects moving about in the Kuiper Belt, which basically is like an asteroid belt just past Neptune. And after several encounters, they ended up orbiting each other like this. Mm-hmm. And as they orbited each other, they gradually spiraled in close to each other due to tidal friction, essentially, losing energy by changing their shape slightly, until it got to the point where they basically stuck. And the rate at which they struck each other was probably about this fast. About like that.
Wow.
So it would have been moving less than a meter a second. So that's enough that even though these are probably crumbly rubble piles, they were able to sort of stick together like that.
Will we get confirmation of that, or are we hoping for confirmation of that from this flyby?
If we understand what the mass of it is. In other words, when the spacecraft went by, its flight path would have curved slightly due to the gravity of Ultima Thule. And if we do that, we can figure out what its mass is. And if we know how big it is, we can then figure out what its density is. So we can get a sense of whether or not it's a solid object or a rubble pile or whatever.
What about the lack of craters, or the concern about the lack of craters?
Well, it's not a concern, it's an exciting fact. The fact that it lacks craters means that not very much has been interacting with it in many billions of years. If this is in fact something left over from the very beginning of the solar system, it's probably covered with a layer of ice, what we call volatiles, things like frozen nitrogen, frozen carbon dioxide, maybe frozen methane. And those volatiles will basically coat the surface, and over time, they might actually flow. For example, frozen nitrogen has roughly the consistency of toothpaste at these temperatures. So if you imagine covering an object with sort of slightly sticky toothpaste, let it sit there for about 10 million years, it's going to level itself out and cover as much of the surface as it can.
And we'll be getting pictures and data back from New Horizons over the course of the next year or so.
Almost
from this
2 years.
Almost 2 years. So it'll be fascinating to see as that comes in. Want to ask you about the Chinese probe that landed on the dark side of the moon. Other than prompting a rash of people to search for their old Pink Floyd albums, which is a joke I'm legally obligated to make when talking about the dark side of the moon, how big of an accomplishment is this scientifically? It's obviously an accomplishment in terms of we can do this.
The thing that's significant about this was exactly where it landed. If you look at the surface of the moon, to us it just looks like a big old rock. But if you look at it in more detail, there's some areas which are higher than others. And it turns out that it landed in an area in the southern hemisphere where it's much lower than the rest of the surface of the moon. We think that's the case because there was an enormous impact there. This region is called the South Polar Aitken Basin. And we think that it may actually be deep enough, have been scooped out enough of a impact in the surface that some of the mantle may have been exposed. In other words, rocks deeper down than we've studied before. All of the Apollo missions landed either on lunar highlands, rocks sticking up above the surface, or they landed on Maria, places where lava flowed out over the surface and sat there and cooled down. But as far as what's below the Maria, what's near the bottom of the crust, this is the first time we've landed anything that is in a location where we think that might be accessible.
Marc Taylor is the manager of the Planetarium and Science programs at the Hudson River Museum in Yonkers, New York. Marc, thank you very much.
Sure.
And for more information about the Hudson River Museum, including their events calendar and their plans to mark the 50th anniversary this year of the first ever moon landing, head over to their website. It's hrm.org. Up next, comedians dealing with controversy again. Kevin Hart is back in the news, so is Louis C.K., and that news usually means bad news. A comic joins me next to weigh in.